really great to see everybody here. Thank you for coming out on a cold and snowy Friday afternoon. I'm Lori Leonard. I was the chair of Emily's dissertation committee. It's really a pleasure to introduce her. It's been a great pleasure to work with her over the last 5.5 years. Is that right? You came in 2019, 5.5 years. So many of you probably know that Emily came to the PhD program with many, many years of experience as a consultant and as a researcher whose focus and interest have always been on gender and development, broadly defined, and on gender transformative approaches to programming and to policy. And this was primarily, but not exclusively, in the agricultural sector. So she's worked for many, many different development organizations and government agencies, ranging from CARE and Catholic Relief Services to the FAO of the United Nations and the Department of State. And Emily's dissertation sort of grew out of those experiences, and particularly her work with CARE in Burundi. You will hear about this from her, but her dissertation is about a really fascinating project in Burundi that came out of the Engage Men and the critical masculinities movements. And I think that sort of in the best anthropological and ethnographic traditions, she's looking at that intervention, but she's looking at that intervention in a set of nested contexts. One of those is placing it in the transitional moment after the civil war in Burundi, when there was an opening really to think about peace and reconciliation and transitional justice, and also placing it in the context of persistent and extreme poverty, particularly rural poverty, that was exacerbated by the challenge of accumulating wealth in a context where there are these recurrent bouts of violence. Emily received a lot of funding, as I recall, for the dissertation research from many different sources, including the American Sociological Association and also the Cornell Center for Social Sciences. And I just want to say, I think, 4 things about Emily and her dissertation that I think are important before turning it over to her. The first, and I think I've alluded to this already, I think the case that she studied is important on multiple registers. As everybody in global development or development studies knows, development interventions always do something. They're always productive of something. I think this one is particularly interesting because it actually did what it aimed to do. And at least in some important measure, maybe not perfectly, maybe not completely, but it actually was considered a success. And in addition to that, I think it is a really important contribution to a broad and deep literature on transitional justice, peace building, and conflict resolution. And that's because of the feminist approach and the feminist lens that Emily applies, which I think draws our attention away from national level politics. And sort of these very grand gestures, like the development of truth and reconciliation committees, and instead it steers us into the realm of the domestic and these very intimate interpersonal relations, which I think are both a novel and an interesting starting point for thinking about transitional justice. The second thing I'll say about Emily is that she's a fantastic writer. The writing in this dissertation is gorgeous. This is going to be a book, and I think it's going to be a book that you will want to read. The third is that, and this should not be a surprise given her past as an independent consultant and researcher, but I had the easiest job in the world. Because Emily needed very little guiding. We had great conversations. I really enjoyed our conversations, but she was self-directed, she was motivated, she was disciplined, and she was incredibly productive. And then finally, I would just highlight her absolute commitment to feminist practice and to pursuing questions of gender and development throughout her career. She's really skilled at thinking about gender transformative work, which is very applied work, but doing that in sophisticated ways. We talk a lot about melding theory and practice, and I think Emily does that seamlessly. She does it really beautifully, and she does it very productively. And that leads me to the very final thing that I'm going to say about her, which is that she has taken a position at KIT in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, which someone is happy about. KIT used to be called the Royal Tropical Institute. My read of it is it's a think tank-like organization, does a lot of work on sustainability and sustainable development, but calls out its commitment to gender in that work. So it's a very nice place, I think, for Emily to land. And while she's there, this dissertation is going to become a book. So I invite you all to enjoy her presentation. The dissertation is titled Creating Peaceful Coexistence in the Context of Chronic Violence, Masculinity, Intimate Violence, and Everyday Reconciliations in Post-Conflict Burundi, which you could have read off the screen, but I just gave it to you. Welcome, thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Lori. And I would also like to start out with my own acknowledgements and thank yous. Thanks especially to my committee, to Lori, to Rachel, and to Judith Byfield, who is not here in this room, especially to Lori for providing really insightful feedback to all of the drafts as I went along. I'm appreciative of the Africana Library staff who provided a great place to write, as Emily will attest. And this is definitely a co-production of research that depended on many colleagues and researchers in Burundi, especially my direct research team, but many others who contributed at various stages to this research. So as Lori has started me off, this dissertation tells the extended story about an intervention called the Abatangamuco, which is defined as a group of men who have literally seen the light or shined the light where there was darkness. And it's an approach that is organized around, it's a group-based approach that was started by this international NGO, Care Burundi, that uses this group-based approach based around these testimonials of personal transformation to catalyze a process of reflection and profound personal change amongst previously violent men. And men who decide to join this collective, this group identity, embrace a new masculine subjectivity based on nonviolence and domestic relations of mutual support. And it's grown into a kind of a sizable movement across Burundi. It has a national structure with more than 8,000 members now. It's drawn the attention of the Ministry of Gender, other development NGOs within Burundi, and of the development community outside of Burundi as well. Hold it up as this very promising and interesting model for engaging men against gender-based violence. And it's written about very enthusiastically in this literature and in some media, which talk about these men as these brave social warriors who are revolutionaries going against tradition to support and empower women by raising men's awareness of gender-based violence. And I myself came across this approach while working with CARE International, and in some visits to Burundi, I had a chance to meet with some of these men and listen to their stories. And I was really struck by the enthusiasm with which they told these testimonials, by the ritual structure of that narrative, which sounded quite like a conversion narrative to me, and by this language of peace and war that they use to talk about their domestic conflict situations. So there's something very evangelical and very homegrown about this approach that I found intriguing. And then it eventually became the subject of my dissertation. And it really sheds light on several intersecting disciplines. It ties into this body of sociological work on this crisis of masculinity across Africa, where in the face of economic and social crises, men are struggling to achieve this hegemonic producer, provider, protector ideal of masculinity. And in the absence of those clear economics roots to this ideal, they may deploy alternative strategies which have mixed implications for gender and for women. And in the Great Lakes region, Dolan has identified this concept of thwarted masculinities, which seems to characterize the situation of many men in chronic conflict conditions where all routes to this hegemonic ideal are thwarted, and men end up retreating into alcohol abuse and aggression and violence. And many have simply dropped out of providing, of farming, and of any household responsibilities. And of course, as an applied intervention, it also ties into this literature on engaging men in positive masculinities, which started in the field of reproductive and sexual health around the HIV/AIDS crisis, which looks at how these group-based models can be deployed to sort of reshape masculine identity to away from some of the more harmful aspects to more positive, responsible, nonviolent forms. And there's some evidence that that can work and produce positive outcomes, but there's also critiques that suggest that these approaches can end up reifying a certain aspect of masculinity rather than really deconstructing that patriarchal relationship. And it also ties into feminist peace and transitional justice studies, which look at how violence, peace, and insecurity from a feminist perspective, looking at how forms of direct violence intersect and are compounded with relations of structural and economic violence, as well as ordinary domestic violence. So I organized my research really around these questions of how this is a group of men who are actively reconstructing masculine subjectivity, which is an interesting case. So exactly how are they doing it? What does this group identity do? What is the point of these personal testimonials? And then what are the other discourses and ideologies of development that are shaping these subjectivities and the way that this approach is evolving? So my dissertation is based on about 10 months of ethnographic research that I did in Burundi in 3 sites. Most of the time was spent in this purple star in the middle of the country in Mutaho commune, which is where I spent a lot of time with some of one particular group of Abatangamuco men in one village and the surrounding villages. And we also spent a lot of time observing the national structure, which has an office in Gitega in that green star. And we were given office space there so that we could tag along to their structured activities as well as just observe their everyday ways of working and practices. And I spent some time as well in Bujumbura, the capital, with NGO actors and government actors and other key informants. And I had a team of 3 full-time research assistants and a group of transcribers and driver. And over the 10 months, we used a number of tools. We used, including baseline surveys and participatory tools. We did a historical timeline to get a mapping of an understanding of the environment in the village to begin with. We did individual life history interviews with each of the men in that group, as well as with the wives, and used a number of other participatory activities as we went along to kind of triangulate different perspectives. And as a white American and as a former NGO staff worker affiliated with CARE, it certainly gave me an insider-outsider perspective that was advantageous as well as disadvantageous. And I definitely relied very much on my research assistants to access spaces and conversations that I wasn't able to. And we actively triangulated what we were hearing and reflected on what was being told as well as what was not being told and what was sort of being presented in a particular way, which was also very informative to some of the chapters as well. And we did organize final reflection sessions in Moyange as well as in Bujumbura. And we'll be organizing another more formal presentation in French after this is finished. So in this presentation, I want to focus mostly on my second chapter, but I want to start out by situating this intervention historically, as Grace sort of alluded to. So Burundi is a very small, densely populated country in this Great Lakes region, which is the site of a number of interconnected and long-running conflicts, and it's currently the poorest country in the world. The pre-colonial social structure was based on a flexible, interconnected hierarchy where ethnicity was not a particularly salient social division, but as elsewhere, the colonizers injected a racialized element to this Hutu-Tutsi division, which became politically entrenched over time, especially after the 1972 genocide, which was the first on the continent. So this post-independence history is marked by episodes of mass violence and instability, including successive political coups and assassinations, mass killings, a protracted civil war. And each of these violent conflicts builds on unresolved grievances from the past and triggers waves of refugee displacements and repatriations, which intensify the already intense land conflicts internally and are spilling over into the regional conflicts as well. Violent conflict in Burundi has been characterized as both chronic and episodic, with these discrete outbursts of violence punctuating periods of enduring and interconnected crises. At the same time, I point out that there are moments of peaceful transition and meaningful social change in that history that are equally important to pay attention to. And in particular, my study focuses on this one such moment after the Civil War, which took place from 1993 to 2005. And that period of Burundi's civil war was also a moment of global optimism and excitement about this liberal paradigm of transitional justice, which was embraced at the time universally as this new paradigm for balancing the demands for justice and accountability, especially for victims of state violence, while balancing the imperative to stabilize and rebuild a deeply divided society. It initially came out of human rights activism in Latin America in the 1980s, and it was explicitly rooted in transition, explicitly meant transition to democracy. So most of the focus in this paradigm was really on top-level institutional reforms, political power sharing arrangements among the elites. But it also offered processes for national reckoning and reconciliation. And these transitional justice roadmaps usually included some form of prosecutions, reparations, and reconciliation through these national truth-telling processes and the public truth and reconciliation commissions that were rooted in this principle that it was important to forgive, but not to forget. So in this historical moment, South Africa, Rwanda, Sierra Leone were putting into practice different experiments and different models of transitional justice. Rwanda has emphasized more the prosecutions through the ICC and the local indigenous courts. South Africa is focused more on the restorative justice elements of the truth-telling in exchange for amnesty and forgiveness. So Burundi was also looked to at the time as another promising terrain for these experiments in transitional justice. And the international community invested heavily in bringing that civil war to an end, with the Arusha Agreement of 2000 representing this standard liberal peace agreement that included power sharing, democratic elections, and a transitional justice plan that included plans for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it was held up at the time as the most exemplary in Africa at the time. And Burundi was held up as this model of transitional justice and democratization. Ultimately, that peace-building process would fail on a grand scale. And today that failure is held up by some scholars as a case in point for all of the critical literature that has grown up around this in this field of transitional justice, which critiques the top-down approach, the focus on political elites, the gender blindness. Nonetheless, at that time, that peace agreement and this transitional justice plan did open up a really important space, a very important moment of optimism and rebuilding and institutional reform that had an impact down to the rural areas. And it created this moment of opening up for civil society, grassroots women's organizations, faith-based organizations, who undertook this grounded everyday work of reconciliation in these war-torn, divided communities. They were led often by the Quaker organizations who played a big role in this process, but these organizations collaborated very actively together in a way that grounded the concepts of transitional justice in a very pragmatic and holistic way. In places like Mutaho, where I did the research, was the Quaker organization who led this process, but worked with the evangelical church and the NGOs to organize these peace-building workshops that would bring together perpetrators of violence with survivors of violence from the different ethnic communities. It was very much a trauma-focused process. They did trauma healing work, spiritual labor, collective memory work, and gradually came to these processes of face-to-face forgiveness and sometimes the public testimonials that would later feed into the national TRC process. And they also engaged in these projects of mutual aid, these rotating credit groups, these rotating livestock groups, so that people were engaged in these mutual aid mechanisms to kind of restore relationships as well as some kind of economic livelihood. And they've created these village level peace committees that remain to this day as kind of a frontline response to preventing and mediating conflict. So the Abatangamuco approach emerges out of this period and out of this grounded experience of CARE Burundi, who worked in partnership with these other NGOs, and they shared modalities and they shared these tactics. And CARE happened to have, as an organization, a focus more on gender and women's empowerment. And they saw an opportunity to address this critical crisis that wasn't addressed in the National Peace Plan or the Transitional Justice Plan, which was the crisis of domestic violence and thwarted masculinity. So those grounded labors of everyday peace building would come to inform how this Abatangamuco approach would work. And it addresses, it helps to restore peaceful coexistence, forgiveness and reconciliation, not just at the community level, but down to the household level, which responded very meaningfully to gender issues that were neglected in the transitional justice process, and also made it an unexpected and lasting success of transitional justice in a way. So my second chapter really focuses on the connection and the compounding factors of gender-based violence, extreme poverty, and chronic conflict, all of which are experienced as chronic conditions in this context. And I start by thinking about the gendered costs of war and conflict, and note that chronic exposure to violence and unresolved trauma has lasting effects that are closely linked to poverty, and households that experience greater violence during the war also experienced greater poverty afterward. And during the 11 years of this war, the army or the various militias would rampage through the villages. People would have to flee at a moment's notice, taking nothing with them. And when they would come back, the crops would be burned, houses would be burned, livestock would be stolen, and neighbors would also steal from each other to survive over time. So it was very difficult to feed a family, to stay alive, and to accumulate any kind of assets. So those who survived the atrocities of the war had to reckon with the compound impacts of the human loss, the trauma, as well as this ongoing battle against poverty. But what it means to be a survivor is also a very gendered experience that has different costs for both men and women. And here's where the concept of thwarted masculinity is clearly at play, because normative masculinity is structured around provision and protection. And to be a man means to be in control, to be decisive, and to be able to provide for the needs of the family. And in the catastrophe of war, the factual inability of men to provide or to protect in these uncontrollable circumstances doesn't change that normative expectation. In fact, as that gap between the lived experience of powerlessness and the lived expectation widens, that unattainable masculinity ideal becomes more sought after rather than less. So many men in these conditions of chronic conflict and poverty experience the anguish of being confronted with unmeetable needs and were unable to solve them. And many ended up giving up and dropping out. And some of them ran away. As I said, men had to flee the house and disappear so they didn't have to face the anguish of having nothing to offer the children. Whereas at the end of the day, women don't have that option to flee. For women, normative femininity and marriage itself is associated with the ideas of endurance and sacrifice. So women learn through marriage to put up with, to manage, to do what they can to protect their children at all costs, even if they have nothing to offer. And they're also structurally dependent on marriage to survive. They don't inherit property, they don't have as many assets, most can't return to their homes because there's no land for them to work there either. And after the war, widows in particular fell deeply into poverty and precarity, and women who were casualties of wartime rape or miscarriage or disability, or who otherwise became unproductive, could be discarded and repudiated, with husbands or siblings conspiring to steal their property, their assets, even the charitable donations that they had been given by mutual aid societies. So when men abandoned these responsibilities, women would take them on, but without the additional resources to manage and without any corresponding authority in the household. This set up a situation of enmity and bitter struggle over unmeetable needs and inadequate resources within the household. And men who dropped out would be stealing from the food stocks to buy alcohol, burning women's clothing, selling their livestock, stealing their savings, and venting frustration and shame in brutal physical and sexual violence against wives and children. So the compounding stressors of extreme scarcity and post-conflict trauma set up intensely hostile relations within the household, which amounted to what felt like an internecine war. And both men and women spoke about family conflict as warfare, and femicide was not uncommon. The literature also confirms that during the post-conflict period, there is a systematic increase in ordinary gender-based violence. And the general societal exposure to extreme forms of direct violence often makes the bystander community less likely to intervene in cases of domestic violence. But I think it's also important to note that the intensification of domestic violence also builds on pre-existing practices that already tolerate a certain extent of ordinary domestic violence. The women that we spoke to, whose wives were part of the Abatangamuco, shared their stories of extreme forms of brutality and humiliation, and these took place pre-war, concurrent with the war, and continued after the war. And many of them said that this, some form of physical or psychological abuse started early in their marriages. And often when they first encountered this kind of any kind of physical violence, they would protest and run to their parents or to their in-laws or to the mediators. And universally, they were told to return and to manage better, to avoid angering the spouse, to manage the conflict. And they were told that which means this is just how families are built. And that was the universal response that they were given. And in the post-conflict period, the local mediation systems were unable to really handle the problem. They couldn't really stop the abusers. And it also added to the problem of poverty because they would charge ceremonial drinks or fees to resolve conflict, which made the problem worse. If a woman was hospitalized or if a spouse threatened to kill the other, then he might end up in jail, but otherwise, most of the mediators simply really didn't know how to respond. So the problem of violence was a significant problem for the local administration as well as the people within the households. And I think it's also important to acknowledge that the fact that this level of violence was tolerated or normalized doesn't normalize the traumatic experience of being abused and violated. And the women who chose to share their stories could vividly recall particular instances and incidents of deep humiliation and injustice, which were deeply painful. And they especially shared the feeling of isolation and loneliness. And many of them said that they eventually sort of fell into silence and literally lost their voice because they had no way of sharing what was going on and couldn't really communicate because of this pain that they felt in their hearts. So in this context, where domestic violence and domestic struggles for survival were experienced as a gendered kind of intra-household warfare, it made a lot of sense to apply a peace and reconciliation approach to this problem. There were other rights-based approaches out there, but the Abatangamuco approach took a different tack, and which seemed to really recognize the problem of thwarted masculinity and the need to focus on men's rehabilitation. And here's where I draw the connection with other restorative justice moments in the US and elsewhere, movements, right? That are looking for alternative models from the criminal justice system that can address the root problems of gender-based violence and offer healing that meets the needs of both offenders and survivors of violence. And I draw on Judith Herman's work with survivors who have identified some key elements that would feel like justice and healing to them. And these include acknowledgement, true apology, accountability, restitution, and rehabilitation. And above all, the survivors are interested in rehabilitation so that others don't have to experience what they have gone through. But globally, there are very few successful evidence-based examples of perpetrator rehabilitation. And I argue that this model is one really important experiment in perpetrator rehabilitation that contributes to that field of research. So because it was rooted in the ethics of transitional justice, this approach did, at least initially, touch on some of these aspects of survivors' justice. And it built initially on these peace-building tactics that they had learned during the peace-building workshops. It brought together men and women separately at first. Men were organized into sex spaces where they listened to other men's stories and heard stories that were similar to their own. And women were also invited to single sex spaces where they could also share their stories and experiences. And over time, they were brought together and over an intensive period of training and listening to each other and sharing of stories. There was a gradual reconnection and that culminated in apology and reconciliation. And as with the trauma-focused peace-building workshops, there was a lot of space and emphasis placed on the emotional release and these emotional confessions and the deep listening processes. As you know, during the peace building workshops, the metaphor was the same. They said that you really had to reopen this wound and express that pain in order for it to heal properly, rather than keeping it inside. So these very emotional, sometimes long processes of people sharing their stories and listening. And as one of the care staff put it, you really have to touch their heads, but also their hearts. And then you need to let them sit with that for some time. Because if you run after them while they're still bleeding inside, it's like you're interrupting a healing process. There was a lot of emphasis placed on tapping into the transformative power of shame, which has also been identified in the literature as key to perpetrators taking accountability for their actions, and also creating space for this deep work of trauma healing. And so over time and over multiple interactions, they would come to individual reconciliations, private reconciliations. And then in a final stage, if the men's efforts to change were deemed sincere, then came the process of the public truth-telling through these public testimonials, where they would share their stories and publicly reconcile with their spouse in front of the community that can attest to both their past behaviors and to their efforts and evidence that they were willing to change and take accountability. So in places like Muyange, this seemed to work. In fact, there was unquestionably a reduction in the worst forms of gender-based violence, moderation of alcohol abuse, and a resumption of economic responsibilities, and a transformation of some of the most down and out and hopeless perpetrators of violence into respectable, responsible, temperate men who are, many of them now, community leaders. So as it evolved, it also created this powerful social mobility pathway for inducted men in the communities. And the masculinity model that it seems to be developing draws from meaningful existing social institutions and ideologies, which are shaping this collective identity and social relationships. And in particular, it seems to draw from the pre-colonial institution of the Bashinganai, or the notables, who were a cadre of community-based mediators. And the character traits of this institution really reflect wisdom and maturity, moderation, and reasoned decisions and an ability to mediate conflict impartially. So when we spoke to men in Moyangi about what it meant to them to be in Abatangamuco, the thing they valued the most was that they were now looked up to give advice and they could resolve and mediate conflicts of the notables. It also draws very clearly on the symbol system of evangelical charismatic traditions, which are a growing sect across Africa. And the public testimonials clearly draw from that symbol of rebirth in the conversion narrative format that is recognizable. And it allows men to make this clean rhetorical break with the past. It also introduces and picks up elements of a Pentecostal masculinity that is also spreading across Africa, which is a masculinity that reorients men toward a domestic focus on the family and monogamy, while also leaving their status as head of household unquestioned. And of course, from interactions with the NGO and development community, as well as the government public discourses about development, gender and citizenship, it also links the idea of modern gender relations of mutual support and nonviolence as the building blocks of economic development, while also advancing this very neoliberal ideology of economic self-help, starting from within the individual household. So it helps to restore the material basis of masculinity by encouraging men and women to join these savings groups and to collaborate together on economic projects while advancing a slightly expanded voice and role for women within the household. So these symbolic and social resources have abundant potential for meaning making, which allows individuals at different levels of this organization to reorganize their lives and their self-identity in aspirational directions. It produces a powerful social mobility route for men and a meaningful collective identity. But for the wives, it seems to tell a different story. Fundamentally, even as it's integrating these elements of a new masculine identity, I would say that this is producing a more restorative rather than transformative masculinity. And this is especially evident when you interact with and listen to the stories of the wives who seem to show an incomplete healing, and they offer many precautions about this approach. When you talk to the men, it sounds like they changed overnight. They said they heard someone else's story. It sounded like he was telling my own story, and I went away and had a personal decision to change, and that's that. But for the wives, when you talk to them, they really emphasize how long it took, over several years, in fact, for them to rebuild trust in that relationship. And it really speaks to the lasting impact of trauma on their own lives, and how long it took for the children to regain trust in their fathers as well. And some of them never did repair that relationship. And in many ways, women continue to do the work of helping to rehabilitate men by forgiving and forgetting the past. And many of them were quite skeptical at first because none of the other mediations had worked and helped. And they said that even after the public testimonial, after that private apology and the public testimonial of apology, it took many years for the children to trust and for the men to demonstrate true apology, which they did through the actions of providing again for the household, paying school fees, bringing oil and meat, and buying clothes for the family. And they were also very adamant about the importance of the ongoing support to the men, that most of this behavior change happened after the public testimonials, and that it was the ongoing support and mentorship that facilitated that rehabilitation. As for the women themselves, they said, many of them said that sharing their story, even telling it again to me, helped them to heal their hearts and ease this pain, and it was healing to a certain extent. But in other cases, when they initially shared their story, they didn't get a very empathetic response from the community. So it can be as well as sort of a re-traumatizing experience to share that if the audience and if the community is not receptive. For many of the women in this community in particular, they're restored to a state of domestic peace and peaceful coexistence, for which they're deeply grateful. They're provided for, their husbands are looked up to, people come to them for advice, but they're not the same dynamic, outspoken, and confident women leaders that you find in other groups in the same village, in the political parties, or in other leadership positions. While their husbands are out publicly organizing this or that meeting, they tend to remain more or less in the background, taking care of the animals. And there is a sense that their own personal healing is incomplete. Most significantly, when we asked them how they would respond if their daughters found themselves in similar situations of abuse in their own marriages, they universally said, I would advise her to remain, be patient, and pray for the husband to change. And this answer speaks to the profound legal and social inequality and deprivation, to the fact that to thrive as a woman is to be married, and to be married still means to endure for better or worse. So even if communities are now more responsive to violence, their own women's own vision of justice remains very much restricted by these profound structural inequalities that are both internalized and externally imposed. So as this approach evolves, it's taken different directions. And what is unique and interesting about this approach is that it is not based on a written theory. And what is appreciated about it from those within it is that it's an approach that was sort of improvised deliberately, and allowed to emerge and kind of evolve under the direction of people within the movement. So it wasn't imported from another context. It's not like the South African approaches where there's a lot of advocacy type of men's engagement work. It's really based on people's lived realities that the communities know. But at the same time, that means that it can take off in somewhat unanticipated directions. There's no coherent single definition of what it means to be an Abatangamuco, what the code of conduct is, what the steps are. It's not written down anywhere. And so it can take off in a very improvisational way in some ways. And as it has grown, or as it was growing as a movement, and it was appearing to be a promising and interesting intervention, there were internal discussions about how it should grow as a movement. And there were some who wanted it to continue as this sort of grassroots, non-hierarchical social movement, and others thought it would be better to institutionalize it as a local partner. And that was the decision that was made sometime around 2011. It was formalized, it was formally registered as an independent institution, where it now has its office, its staff, its pickup truck, and its logo. And as a national structure, so it essentially acts as a local partner, and engages with CARE and the government in that manner. And as a national structure, it's kind of taken on the personality and the ambitions of its very charismatic leader, who was the second man ever to join this Abatangamuco movement. And he has very close ties with the government administration, and he uses those patronage relationships and his own social entrepreneurship to really grow the movement and the membership of the organization especially. And he comes from a region that's famous for its community theater, so he's also added that element of the community theater and that performativity, which enables him to reach an audience in a very emotional, moving, and engaging way as well. So they're able to reach a broader audience in this still very performative but meaningful way. But it has also taken on his own personal version of masculinity, which is of that Pentecostal masculinity variety. He's very clear in their engagements on the clear limitations of how far women's empowerment should go. And it focuses more on the economic benefits to men and the benefits of these mutual support relations within the household, rather than the focus on gender-based violence as such and women's empowerment as such. So this creates some unresolved tensions within at different levels of the movement, and certainly for some within Care Burundi, for example, they're quite well aware that is going off in a direction that doesn't align with their own personal institutional goals for a focus on women's empowerment, for example, but they also value their engagement with local partners, and there's a limit to the kind of influence that they can have in this dynamic. So it continues to evolve. And but it embodies some very clear contradictions and tensions that have not been fully resolved. So I will just give some concluding thoughts about what this case study means. I feel that this study really centers Africa and Africans as drivers of innovation, not just sites of crisis and chaos. And it has really important contributions to several fields of the studies of transitional justice, masculinities, and feminist peace building. For all of its limitations, I think that this approach has demonstrated that it's possible to center rather than defer the injustices of gender-based violence in these transitional justice processes. It's recognized as a problem, but there's very few effective policies or programs that have addressed this. And this model has shown that that can be done and that it can foster peaceful relations within that community as well as in the households. I argue as well that it's an important experiment in perpetrator rehabilitation, one that significantly reduces gender-based violence, helps to restore men to social responsibility, and create some spaces for survivors' healing, even if it needs to do much more in that direction. I think that this also introduces a new vocabulary and meaningful tactics for addressing these compound cases, crises of violence in a chronic conflict context. The idioms of domestic warfare and peace and the symbols of ritual rebirth are particularly compelling in this post-conflict setting. And it offered new tactics and new ways of thinking about and addressing these conflicts. On the other hand, that framing of peaceful cohabitation doesn't do enough. And it can to transform the power relationship that is there in the household. And it can, in fact, end up suppressing a necessary degree of conflict that would indicate a more genuine, meaningful renegotiation of power relations in the household. And finally, unless an intervention like this is really connected to struggles confronting the injustices of extreme poverty and women's structural dependence, a peace and reconciliation can do some good, but it can really only bring partial justice and peace to these households. And then finally, as Lori mentioned at the beginning, I think that this adds to the body of critical literature on transitional justice and really underscores the turn toward a more feminist perspective and a lens of everydayness, which goes beyond just the community level, but into that intra-household level, and looks at these intimate labors and relational practices that go into resuming ordinary life after extraordinary violence. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I will facilitate questions. Who has them? Thank you, Emily. That was a fantastic presentation. Yes.
Thank you, Emily, and congratulations. I think as a peer from the same cohort, it's such amazing to see you finally made it through. Yeah, it's just a really great presentation, and I really enjoyed the way you're telling it. I have two questions. One is more like a clarification, technical question is how the organization, first, how the organization actually measured the effect of their sessions or their intervention, especially when it relates to transformation of people's behavior or even the personality, right? I really wondering how they monitor this through what kind of criteria or like techniques. That's number one. Number two is you mentioned like the focus of your research is more on the household level, but you also bring about when women sharing experience in a community that originally not super receptacle, it's a lot of pressure. So is there at the same time, what kind of changes brought on the community level happens that makes this kind of intervention easier over time? Yeah, that's basically my questions.
In terms of the monitoring, I haven't seen any particular evaluations of this program itself. It's more of projects in which it's been embedded. And they do surveys that integrate some of the images studies, so surveys of men's attitudes and practices and masculinity attitudes. So there are some evaluations that are embedded within project evaluations and reports. But the evidence that I'm talking about from this particular village is people's descriptions and the wives' descriptions of these very clear changes in people's and observations. There was very clear transformations of behavior. So there is not perhaps that quantitative evidence or behavior change in a systematic way outside of the project evaluations. But in terms of the community level supports, the way that CARE is working with this organization is it's usually embedded within other projects that do, because they also do work on women's empowerment and solidarity with women's groups themselves. So there's generally some other community interventions going on. And they measure that through this participatory scorecard that looks at various indicators of community development, and which include peaceful relations, not just at the domestic level, but the administration, the government administration talks about where these organizations are in place, where this group exists. There are far fewer conflicts of any kind because there's more local bodies that are there to resolve these conflicts. There are fewer of the bar fights and just regular neighborly conflicts because there's been this work done on the from the men, and because there's more of these peacekeeping mediators in place who can intervene earlier. I'll do it.
Thank you. This is very, very interesting. And just in your answer to this question, you started getting at the question I'm going to ask, which is this was all very individually focused, and the collective piece that I heard about most in your presentation was the Pentecostal church. I didn't hear as much about the organizational structure of the movement, but what I did hear seemed to be all male dominated. So it's no surprise to me that women get the incomplete healing. But then just now you mentioned that this is part of something that CARE does and is linked to other interventions that they're making at the same time that have substantive economic maybe agricultural productive pieces to them that complements this relational, social, cultural piece. And I don't know if you were here when Jan Lowe presented in the seminar series in the fall, but she was doing something similar. I think Care was also the partner, and it was gender dialogues at the family level. Ghana? But they were also doing some other, the project more generally was about food and health as wealth, like changing, like you should eat the best food you have, not just sell it, because health is wealth. In any case, Care was absent in your presentation about the more collective or institutional structure of this. And I wonder if you might speak to the role of collective and community structures that facilitate this kind of individual behavior change.
I would say it's a collective process. It is a group-based process, and it was a process that was identified and kind of emerged from CARE's work in that post-conflict period. They were engaged in this appreciative inquiry exercise and listening to sort of how they should orient their programs to be most helpful in this reconstruction period. And that's when they heard this story of one person's personal transformation that kind of gave the idea for organizing this into more of a collective movement. So it was initially very much under the direct implementation of CARE Burundi, and many under the direct leadership of some of these very engaged female staff as well, who were very much steeped in attention to women's empowerment and solidarity, and guided that process. And then it branched off. They made a decision, or as a group, it was decided that it should be institutionalized as a national local partnership, which is also one of their organizational values. And so you see it kind of taking off in that direction, because it is now led by men who have a certain self-interest in their own status quo. But it is very much a group-based approach. And like the peace committees and like many of these other solidarity groups, it's organized principally around these savings groups. And that's the mechanism that keeps them together. There is some sort of financial solidarity mechanism that binds them as a group. And then they also have the responsibility to engage as mediators and to intervene in conflicts as well. So it's sort of a formalized induction process. And once they become formalized members, it's kind of a position for life. It's like an honorary title, and it's kind of in line with those notables. They're recognized as having met this good character criteria. And so people look to them as advisors and as mediators. But it does interact with other interventions, other care interventions, other NGO interventions, other government interventions. And the structure, the national structure, they do a lot of work in these civil weddings, these pre-wedding ceremonies for young couples, and they do these community theaters where they're passing messages and doing these demonstrations that talk about gender-based violence and about women's asset ownership rights within marriage. I don't know if that answered your question.
I know it helps that there's a material piece that's included with this.
Yeah, which was very important to that reestablishment of men's self-worth and dignity and responsibilities. That was a very
women aren't leaders, only men.
In this movement, they are not. It's mainly, well, again, it depends on who you ask, because if you talk to people within the structure, they say, yes, women are also members. If you talk to the care people from the initial days, they say, no, it's only men, because the definition of an Abatangamuco is a man who has changed. So there's tension and there's differences in how people define what it means as well. Yeah, but there are other programs that really support women's empowerment, and that's where you can very clearly see the difference between women who are just wives who've gone through this process and women who have gone themselves through a more intensive solidarity process.
Thank you so much, and congratulations. I think your topic is a really emotional one with peacemaking and healing that deals with so much trauma and violence. I was wondering, how did you interact with these really strong emotions, and how do those strong emotions show up in a scholarly way in your research? And maybe part two of the question is, how did you deal with your own emotions? I feel like it's a lot to manage.
It's just a lot, and it was very painful, and it took me a while to go back to some of them. And we tried to create every possibility for women to not share if they didn't want to, and there were some who didn't want to, but many of them had shared their stories before, and so because they've done the testimonials, they were not, it wasn't the first time, and they went very deeply into very intimate details right away, and often did stop, and there was a lot of emotion during those interviews and like history stories, and we did them in private, away from any listener, and it was very painful for all of us afterwards, as you know, as we sat and reflected on the team as well. It was very disheartening, and we tried our best not to push anyone who wasn't interested in sharing what they had to share. And it was very interesting as well to observe some of the testimonials, which, you know, from hearing about it, I expected these to be these very, very personal, intimate testimonials, but those were not what we saw. They were more rote, and so I feel like they also have contain what they share in public as well too. But so there was maybe this very emotional, intimate sharing in the more private spaces, but in these public testimonials, it tends to be a bit more generic, and it doesn't go into those intimate details that they don't want to share.
Thank you so much. Echoing really important work and work that is, respect the care and attention that you brought to this. I did have a bit of a question on this. In some of the places, like in other places in the Great Lakes region, even though they might be characterized as a post-conflict region, it's fairly frequently an upsurgence of some sort of event or some sort of continued violence, sort of thing that can cause disruption to the community, that can cause mobility. And I was just wondering, like thinking about the time frame of this, of course, this is sort of post, like after the war, but I'm wondering within that period, if you heard from anyone describing moments where the community was maybe displaced or made more mobile or had some sort of disruption. And if there was any way that the sort of these identities were to be tested in sort of oftentimes what can be sort of repeated upheavals of the community.
Well, I would characterize this, and I do characterize this as a chronic conflict in environments, not really post anything. Those conditions are still there, and there was all kinds of political upheaval and economic crisis, fuel crisis. It's ongoing. In this particular village, there wasn't so much displacement since after the Civil War, and even in the recent political violence. But there was a lot of migration back and forth from that village to the city for work. And so you could see a bit of a difference in sort of the life stories of the younger members and some of the older members, just in terms of the challenges that they encountered as younger men who, often as youth went to the city to do any kind of manual labor that exposed them to different kind of stressors and character challenges. And so they kind of they attached more readily to this identity because it very clearly offered this social mobility, aspirational identity at the very least. And this group solidarity mechanism. Whereas the older generation, the ones who had gone through this intensive training, they didn't map it as a central moment in their lives, even though they were very much part of this movement as they were tracing their history past, because they'd been through much more. But it was an interesting reflection of what that identity means to the younger generation versus this older generation who had been through much more of even from the 1972 genocide, we still have memories of that. But very much not post-conflict, I would say.
Congratulations. Mine is more of a methodological, personal question and it's a question. I was wondering how you managed to penetrate their world. Like, firstly, I'm sure you worked with people from there. How did the masculinities, the men themselves, who you worked with, played out? How, yeah, I can just imagine you with a different color and in a different space. How did all of that work out? Just curious.
I definitely didn't blend in. And we went regularly. We made visits about 4 times a week for this sort of structured activities. But my research team were men. And they did some more of the unstructured observations, some of the hanging out in bars and male spaces, and even sitting in on some of the mediations that I obviously could not really be part of. So it definitely, I was always very aware of my positionality and the fact that I was always going to be looked like as someone who had, potential patronage ties, who could potentially bring some kind of benefit, or being connected to the NGO definitely shaped the way that people presented their stories and the way that they talked about things to me. We tried to build relationships over time and through these repeated engagements, build trust and be able to access different community spaces, as well as triangulate what other people were saying. And through these different exercises and talking with different groups in that community as well.